Chukma, Nitaki Chukma, good morning, in Chickasaw. My name is Brad Lieb, and I serve as Director of Chickasaw Archaeology for the Chickasaw Nation. And I'd like to talk to you today about a story, an old story, about the first contact between Chickasaws and Europeans that occurred in the year 1540, almost 500 years ago today. And this contact was, of course, with the Hernando de Soto expedition, the first Spanish expedition of so-called conquistadors that penetrated the interior of the southeastern United States. DeSoto was searching in what he called La Florida, all of the southeast, for gold and cities and peoples to conquer, so he could become a conquistador. And he had participated in the conquest of Peru with Pizarro, and so he was experienced in the ways of exploitation of indigenous peoples of the so-called New World. And he had obtained from the king the right to explore La Florida. And so in the year 1539, he financed the expedition with ships out of Seville, Spain, to Cuba, where he was actually the governor of Cuba, which had already been conquered. And he landed in Tampa Bay, Florida in 1539 with a number of ships, disembarking about 600 men. There were knights and nobles from Spain and Portugal with him, people seeking their fortune here in the so-called New World, and foot soldiers with arquebus, matchlock firearms of the day, and crossbows, and chainmail armor, and steel swords, and spears, and pikes, and weapons of all kinds, and also horses and lances. And we should note that the Native Americans, the first Americans, had not seen horses in about 10,000 years at this time in the 16th century, because the Pleistocene horse had gone extinct around the turnover of the Pleistocene to the Holocene, the end of the Ice Age, about 12,000 years ago. So also pigs, Spanish Extremaduran hogs, were brought on the expedition to establish pigs in the so-called New World and as food for the expedition. So these 600 men and the livestock and horses landed in Florida and began to almost immediately trouble the native people in that area for food and for burden bearers, slaves, and in their search for gold, which was, of course, fruitless, because gold was not a thing in the southeast of North America at that time, and it was not used or valued by the native people like it was in Mexico and South America, where the Spanish had struck it rich, so to speak, with conquering those indigenous nations that were rich in gold. So DeSoto proceeded on a somewhat stochastic route across the southeast, going from community to community of native people that we refer to today as Southeastern Indians, and basically eating them out of house and home, and sometimes battling with them, and generally behaving badly as an uninvited guest or terrorist. And so the native people soon learned that what he was after, and they began to tell him, oh, the people that way have gold. And so that served to get him out of their hair and to lead him off somewhere else. So he went up into the mountains of the North Carolina, Tennessee area, knowing that gold often comes out of mountain streams, and still not finding any. He ended up coming down the Coosa River drainage into Alabama, and down into central Alabama, where he encountered a chiefdom known as Tuscaloosa, or the Black Warrior. And Tuscaloosa Minco was captured and sort of held at knife point, which was a standard strategy of the Spanish to comply, to get compliant behavior from the indigenous people. And so this occurred, and Tuscaloosa traveled with DeSoto down into central Alabama and to a town called Mobile, which is the origin of the town known as Mobile today, but not necessarily in that exact location, further north. And so, in short, the Tuscaloosa was able to ambush the DeSoto expedition with thousands of native warriors, and a very large battle ensued called the Battle of Mobile. And the Spanish lost about 25 men and a number of horses, and almost all were wounded, and allegedly thousands of native people were killed, and the town was burned, and the Spanish lost a lot of their equipment and supplies, which had been stashed in this town by the native burden bearers. So it was a disastrous event for both the Spanish and the indigenous Mobilians. And Chief Tuscaloosa was apparently killed in the battle, but we don't know. They couldn't find him after the battle. So after that, a lot of the Spanish men wanted to leave and go back to Cuba or go back to Spain, because obviously there was no gold here, and they were not finding cities of compliant people that they were hungry, and all the tribes they encountered were warriors, and it was a pretty terrible experience for the Spanish and for the indigenous people that they were abusing. So DeSoto, however, had mortgaged his life, so to speak, on this expedition, and so he could not fail in his mind. He could not admit to failure of this expedition. So instead of going south from the sort of South Alabama area where the Battle of Mobile occurred, he turned the expedition back to the north and northwest, and that is how he got to east central to northeast Mississippi area, which was known at that time as the province of Chickasaw. And so when DeSoto and his men came to the banks of the Tombigbee River, we believe in the vicinity of Columbus, Mississippi, in December of 1540, they were opposed on the opposite bank by a large group of Chickasaw warriors who fired arrows and made war cries and were painted red and black for war. And so this crossing into hostile territory was executed by sending some horsemen upriver and building a raft and getting them across, and then attacking the Chickasaws with the lances from horseback, which was a novel thing to the native people at that time. And so the Chickasaws, rather than fight a big pitched battle and take a lot of losses, they withdrew. And so the Spanish proceeded for a day's ride into a savanna-like province, which is today known as the Blackland Prairie, that extends from northeast Mississippi down through east Mississippi and down into Alabama in the Selma area. And that is a physiographic province of soil types and underlying geology that produces a more open, rolling terrain, much pasture and row crop land today, but an area that was not as forested as most of all the rest of the land in the southeast. And so this Blackland Prairie was where the Chickasaws were living in 1540, and the exact location has long been a source of conjecture and archaeological research. But in recent years, beginning in 2015, we at Chickasaw Nation were lucky to partner with the University of Mississippi, University of Florida, and University of South Carolina to put together a team that actually found some of the first archaeological evidence of DeSoto's presence in Mississippi, and that is in the Starkville area, which is about 50 miles south of Tupelo, which is the traditional homeland center of Chickasaw people. So there had evidently been a move between the time of DeSoto and the time of the French and British in the 1600s and 1700s. And so with these archaeological findings, we now believe that the Chickasaws were located in the Starkville area in 1540. And that is where they encountered Hernando de Soto and his men. And so, as we noted, that encounter began with violence and it ended with violence. But the Spanish had a custom of basically camping for the winter. They did not move the army during the winter. They would encamp in a native community and await spring to move the expedition further. And so they did this at a town called Chickasaw, that was located apparently somewhere in the Starkville area. And it was a sort of uneasy peace. The Chickasaw Minko, or chief, came to visit DeSoto and gave a gift of nuts and rabbits, rabbit pelts, and basically food and clothing, which the Spanish were in dire need of. And so there was an uneasy peace, and actually Chickasaw Minko asked DeSoto to help him in a conflict with a colleague of his named Moclasa, who was a Minko of the Chocchuma, neighboring tribe that the Spanish wrote that Chickasaw Minko said that Chocchuma had not paid tribute to pay their taxes, so to speak, to the Chickasaw. And so DeSoto thought this might be a ruse to split his army, and it may have been, but he ended up sending, I think, 40 horsemen and as many footmen with Chickasaw Minko to go make a raid against the Chocchuma. And they did that, and they found the Chocchuma town empty and abandoned, and emptied of corn and other stored food. So someone had tipped them off. And that is an event that was recorded by the Spanish in that winter of Chickasaw, the winter of 1541. Another event that occurred was the Spanish had some hogs, some of their pigs go missing, and they accused Chickasaws of stealing them. And so DeSoto had a couple of Chickasaws shot, executed by crossbow, and then he had the hands cut off of another and sent back to the Chickasaws to send a message to not to steal from the Spanish. So that event was recorded in the Spanish chronicles of that winter as well. So what the Chickasaws had done was basically abandon a village so that the Spanish would stay there. And they also provided food supplies, somewhat limited, but they did not want the Spanish to be marauding around the countryside searching for their food supplies. And so the Chickasaws probably retreated to other villages or to their hunting camps in the woods and basically hid from the Spanish over that winter. Although there was contact, there was visits almost daily by men and women apparently engaging in trade with the Spanish soldiers. Small items of food, likely on the Chickasaw side, were being traded for small pieces of metal, such as a piece of a brass or copper kettle, or a piece of iron from a broken weapon or tool, or even the iron bands around the wooden barrels that the Spanish had were a source of this raw material for trade, because iron was a novel substance to the Chickasaws at that time, and so they worked it with stone tool techniques, and they sort of pecked it and ground it into celts and chisels and scrapers and other tools. So we find those archaeologically, and it's very fascinating to see the first use of iron in native hands and what they did with it. And they made tools of their own design with that European material. And so the winter was a cold one. The Spanish wrote that the snow fell a foot thick and lay for 2 weeks, which is unusual for Mississippi even today. And they as spring approached, the Spanish began to make plans to leave and continue their expedition. And as usual, they asked Chickasaw Minko, the leader, for 300 people to carry food and supplies, burden bearers. and the Spanish were engaged in enslaving native people and had been for decades around the coastlines of North America and in the Caribbean and in Central and South America. And so they had chains, they had these collars and chains with them to chain the native people together to carry their supplies. So Chickasha asked for a few days to get these people together for the Spanish. But what he did instead was he began to plan an attack. And so the Chickasaw leaders planned an attack for a night attack to set the village on fire and attack the Spanish and drive them from Chickasaw territory. And so they began to approach each night for a period of about 2 weeks. They would beat their drums and make war cries in the night, approaching the Spanish and causing alarms, but then they would never attack. And so by doing this every night, they lulled the Spanish into a sense of complacency. And the Spanish did believe that they were superior culturally and technologically, and they did not believe that they could be defeated by indigenous people that had no metal weapons or armor. And so they were arrogant, if you will. And so their defenses were not maybe as strong as they should be. For example, no palisade wall was built around their camp. And so the Chickasaws continued to come at night and beat drums and make war cries and frighten the Spanish at first, but then after about 2 weeks of this, the event that the Chickasaws were waiting on occurred, and that was the occurrence of a cold front. This was in March, early March. March 4th is written in some of the Spanish accounts of 1541. And so with this cold front, so common in that early spring period, northwest winds, strong northwest winds were blowing that night. And this was the condition the Chickasaws needed to help set the fires onto the Spanish encampment, which was an indigenous village with added structures. So they brought fire in pots, and they attached it to arrows, and they launched their attack in this night of March 4th, 1541. And so the village was very quickly engulfed in flames with these strong northwest winds blowing on the dry thatch and wooden, combustible materials that were everywhere in this settlement. And so with that, the warriors came in, they rushed in with their war clubs and bows and arrows, making war cries painted in red and black, as was traditional for warfare. And the Spanish were really caught off guard. And the Spanish were trying to get out of bed, and they were trying to put on their armor, trying to get on their horses. DeSoto was trying to strap his saddle onto his horse and try to lead a defense of some sort. And the Chickasaws are shooting arrows and clubbing people, and pigs are getting out, horses are getting out. It's total chaos in this conflagration. And DeSoto, one account says that DeSoto came out on his horse with a lance and rode out among the Chickasaws in an attempt to make a counterattack. But when he went to thrust his lance, his saddle was not buckled well, and so he was pulled down off the horse. And he was captured, essentially, for a few moments. And so that caused his men to rush toward him, which was in effect a charge. And so the Chickasaws sort of fell back from that area, because in Chickasaw warfare it was an ethic to not lose any men. There were no expendable soldiers in the European concept. Every person was a member of your kinship and in your society, and so ambush and surprise were very strong elements of native warfare. And so the Chickasaws, pretty much after striking this heavy blow, withdrew as quickly as they had appeared. And the Spanish, of course, attributed it to a great miracle of God, because they knew that they could have been completely destroyed by these thousands of warriors that had come upon them, because the Spanish only numbered, maybe 400 and something men by that time in the expedition. And so the Spanish actually fled the burning town and went to a hill a league away, a couple miles away, and encamped again in a defensive formation. And so the Spanish accounts say that many of the men were literally naked because they had been burned out in the night while they were asleep. And so what few supplies they had left were burnt up in the flames at Chickasaw. And so the Chickasaws had relayed their message. They had attacked the Spanish with a heavy blow. Some dozen to 15 men had been killed, the Spanish, and almost every man was wounded in some respect. And so the Spanish wrapped their wounds and encamped on this hill that they called Chickasaw, which is just Little Chickasaw in Spanish. And they suffered there for 2 to 3 more weeks. And they were attacked again by the Chickasaw, but they fended the attack off because they were really on their guard by this time. And so as soon as the wounded were healed enough to move, they quickly moved out of Chickasaw territory. They had actually had to build a forge to retemper their weapons that had been burned in the fire. And so that forge has long been an archaeological goal to find that location with all that charcoal and slag that and some sort of brick ceramic that would be a trace of that forge. And the account even says that they used the barrel of their small swivel gun or cannon as a forcing tube, and they made a bellows out of bear skins. And so with that, the Spanish left the Chickasaw province in the spring of 1541, and the Chickasaws were not revisited by a European expedition for over 100 years after that. And so from that first initial contact with the Spanish and the defeat of the Spanish in what's called the Battle of Chickasaw, the Chickasaws derived their unofficial motto of unconquered and unconquerable that still pertains today.